The elderly woman was still making her way across the street when the billionaire emerged from his car. Before a single person could even move, he slapped her, then kicked her, and screamed for her to get out of the way. She collapsed sobbing before gathering her firewood and disappearing down the street in silence. He peeled away laughing to himself, completely oblivious that he had just single-handedly demolished his own future. Because starting that very day, his life fell apart. If you agree that arrogance can destroy someone faster than being broke, make sure to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below. And pay close attention. This tale will alter how you look at other people. Now allow me to take you back to where it all started. His name was Damian Cade, and the very sound of it was enough to make people's bodies go rigid. In the cities governed by wealth, Damian wasn't just wealthy, he was a force to be reckoned with. His reputation was ruthless because in the world of business, he never showed an ounce of compassion. He was considered arrogant because he never bent his knee to a single soul. And he was deemed untouchable because no matter how many rivals he created, nothing could ever bring him down. That man was simply born blessed. People would whisper, "Destiny is on his side." Damian believed it himself. With a cold grin, he often declared, "The strong own this world. The weak are just passing through." The moment he stepped into a space, every conversation would halt. When he gave a command, everyone obeyed not from admiration, but from the fear of what he could strip away from them. His business empire was more expansive than most could ever fathom. He held controlling stakes in shipping, construction, oil, and technology. Entire garages were filled with his luxury vehicles, each one more extravagant than the last. Private jets were stationed at airports for him, like loyal attendants, ready to whisk him to any destination at a moment's whim. His mansions dotted hills and coastlines fortified by high walls and armed security properties so vast and silent they often felt deserted. At night, he would sit in chambers of glass and gold, looking down on cities filled with people he saw as beneath him. "Look at them," he once commented to a business associate swirling the wine in his glass. "All of them struggling. I refuse to be one of them." The partner let out a nervous laugh, torn between agreeing and remaining quiet. Everywhere he went, women flocked to him. Their smiles were a little too bright, their laughs at his jokes a little too loud, and they'd touch his arm with a sense of ownership. They were in love with his cars, his homes, and his influence. They were drawn to the glitter of his fortune, the access his name provided, and the lifestyle he could afford them. But whenever Damian gazed into their eyes, he saw no genuine warmth, just cold calculation. Even so, it didn't matter to him. "Love is for the poor," he once stated, pulling a woman closer as cameras flashed. "Money is faithful. People are not." So that was his life, admired, envied, and constantly surrounded, yet fundamentally alone, perched atop a world he thought he commanded, unaware that the very things he relied on were already dissolving. To Damian, poor people weren't human beings with their own stories. They were inconveniences he wished would simply vanish. In his worldview, poverty was a character flaw. He was convinced the poor were just lazy, often saying that if they put in more effort, they wouldn't be on the streets. He saw them as filthy, not just in their attire, but in their very souls. He considered them useless, believing they offered the world nothing but complaints and chaos. Whenever the subject arose, his tone would always turn to steel. "Do you know the reason they're poor?" he once asked during a corporate dinner. "It's because they wallow in their own suffering. They're content with it." Someone attempted a gentle counterpoint, saying, "Sir, some people just have bad luck." Damian just scoffed a dry, bitter sound. "Luck," he shot back. "Luck favors those who refuse to be fragile." He stayed away from markets where voices were raised in bargaining and the air was thick with sweat and dust. He detested slums with their cramped alleys, deteriorating houses, and the palpable sense of hardship that hung in the air. Any place that smelled of struggle made him uneasy, angry, and agitated. If his driver ever took a route that went near a poor area, Damian would roar from the back seat, "Turn around immediately. I don't want to look at this disaster." He would seal the window shut as if poverty itself were a disease that could seep in and contaminate him. To him, these areas were a reminder of a life he loathed and was terrified of ever experiencing. Beggars had the worst effect on him. The image of an outstretched, trembling hand pleading for help would make his stomach lurch. His face would harden with revulsion. He would sometimes feel physically ill, as though the very air around them was toxic. "Don't let them get close to me," he would snap at his bodyguards. "They reek of failure." One time, a young beggar came up to his car at a stoplight, knocking faintly on the window. Damian went berserk. "Get away from me," he yelled. "Go find something productive to do with your life." The light went green, the car accelerated, and the boy was left behind, appearing small and baffled in the exhaust fumes. Damian fell back into his seat, breathing heavily with a fire of rage in his chest. To him, the poor were a symbol of everything he despised, and he renewed his vow every single day that he would never, ever become one of them. His motorcade sliced through the streets like a moving declaration of power. A motorcade of 3 black SUVs led the way with his own stretched luxury sedan, flanked by 2 more at the rear. The sirens were off, but it didn't matter. Everyone on the road knew who commanded this space. Drivers instinctively eased off their accelerators while some veered to the side without a second thought. Others, caught off guard, swerved in a panic. Inside the serene cabin of his car, Damian sat in the back, one leg crossed over the other, his eyes glued to his phone as he scrolled through a series of messages that only soured his mood. A muscle twitched in his clenched jaw, and his fingers drummed an impatient rhythm on the leather armrest. He was already on edge. Up ahead, the traffic suddenly congealed, cars bunching up like a herd. Their forward progress slowed to an agonizing crawl. Damian's head snapped up, his face contorting in irritation. "Why are we stopping?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with menace. The driver scanned the scene ahead and chose his words carefully. "Sir, there's a bottleneck up ahead. We should be through it shortly." Damian scoffed. "I don't pay you to crawl in traffic," he sneered. "Get this road cleared." One of his security detail leaned into the front, speaking discreetly into his radio, but the path ahead failed to open up quickly enough to appease Damian. His breathing became more pronounced. He loathed waiting. Waiting reduced him to the level of ordinary people. The car inched forward, only to slow again, this time coming to a near-complete stop. Damian slammed his open palm against the seat. "What is this nonsense?" he snapped. "Has the entire city decided to get in my way today?" The driver swallowed nervously. "Sir, there's something in the road. It seems someone is crossing." Damian leaned forward, his expression darkening as he peered through the heavily tinted glass. "Someone," he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Move them. My schedule doesn't bend for a nobody." Outside, the car horns started to blare over the hum of idling engines. Time itself seemed to stretch and thin out. The vehicle crept forward at a snail's pace, slower and slower, until it was barely moving at all. Damian's patience finally shattered, and a hot, ugly rage surged in his chest, desperate for a target. She appeared in the road so quietly it was as if the world had gently placed her there. An old woman, her body small and brittle, worn down by years that had taken far more than they had ever given. Her back was stooped not by choice but by the endless burden of time and a life carried on her shoulders for too long. Every crease on her face was a testament to her resilience. Her hands trembled, a symptom not of fear but of profound weakness. And yet even in her fragility, there was a quiet dignity to her posture. Balanced on her head was a heavy, awkward bundle of firewood. Thick, dried branches were lashed together with a fraying rope, the weight pressing down on her skull, forcing her neck into an even deeper bow. Each step she took was a study in effort. Every movement was an act of patience. She didn't hurry. She couldn't hurry. The road was a wide, hard surface beneath her bare feet, and the load she carried made her sway with a gentle, precarious rhythm. She paused once to draw a breath, her trembling fingers reaching up to adjust the bundle. "Easy, easy," she whispered to herself, her voice almost lost in the wind. She glanced to her left, then to her right. Cars sat idle, their engines murmuring. People stared from behind their windshields, their expressions remote and shielded by glass. The woman lifted a foot and placed it down with immense care. One step, then another. Her knees ached in protest. Her ankles wobbled. The firewood shifted, and she froze, a flicker of fear in her eyes that it might fall. She steadied herself and pushed onward. Her breathing was shallow now, coming in ragged little puffs. But still she pressed on. A driver yelled from somewhere down the line. "Hey, Grandma, get a move on!" Another voice added, sharp with impatience. "You're blocking the whole road." The woman offered no reply. She simply ducked her head lower and continued walking. The distance to the other side felt immense. Each step seemed to stretch time itself. Her shadow trailed behind her, looking as weary as she was. Sweat trickled down her temples. Her lips quivered, not from the cold but from sheer exertion. As she reached the halfway mark, she stumbled slightly before finding her balance again. "God help me," she murmured, her eyes glistening. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't seeking attention. She just wanted to cross the road, struggling slowly, hauling not just wood, but the crushing weight of age, poverty, in a life that had shown her no kindness. And as she advanced inch by painstaking inch, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind her, the atmosphere grew heavy and silent, like the electric calm before lightning strikes. The moment Damian saw her, clearly, something inside him snapped. His face twisted not with surprise, but with pure, unadulterated rage. His breathing changed. It became fast, sharp, and furious. "This is it," he muttered, his voice shaking with violent anger. "This is the last straw," he said, slamming his phone onto the seat. He leaned forward. "Stop the car," he barked. The driver hesitated. "Sir, she's almost all the way across." Damian turned his head slowly, his eyes burning with intensity. "I said, stop." The car. The brakes engaged. The engine settled into a quiet idle. Before anyone could utter another word, the door was thrown open. Damian stepped out, a tempest breaking free. His leather shoes hit the pavement with a sharp crack. He didn't just walk, he charged. "Are you out of your mind, model man? Are you blind?" he roared, his voice tearing through the silence. The elderly woman flinched, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Please, sir," she managed, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper. "I'm just trying to—" He cut her off before she could finish. "Trying to what?" he shrieked. "Trying to get in my way." Occupants in the surrounding vehicles were paralyzed. Windows remained sealed. Not a soul stirred. Damian lifted his hand and struck her across the face. The crack of the slap was sharp and brutal. Her bundle of firewood lurched as she cried out, stumbling backward. "Move!" he bellowed. She lost her footing completely and collapsed onto the pavement, the firewood spilling across the asphalt. A few people gasped, but nobody dared to intervene. Damian loomed over her fallen form. "Useless old hag," he hissed. "You want to die right here in the street." With trembling hands, she attempted to pull herself away, tears welling in her eyes. "Please," she pleaded softly. "Please." His temper flared and his foot shot out before he could think. He kicked her a vicious blow that tore another cry from her lips. "Get off the road," he roared. "Just disappear." The unforgiving command hung in the air. A security guard shuffled his feet uneasily but remained silent. Other drivers averted their gaze. The scene held everyone captive. The woman, now sobbing openly with agony, etched on her face, fought to get up. With slow, agonizing effort, she began to rise. Damian jabbed a finger at her. "Now," he commanded, "move." She collected herself, gathering the scattered wood with unsteady hands. She hoisted it back onto her head and started to move on. Nobody made a move to stop him. Not a word was spoken. The only sounds on the road were her muffled sobs and Damian's ragged, angry breaths. After watching her hobble away, he spun back to his car, letting out a harsh laugh. "Fools," he grumbled under his breath. He yanked his car door shut. The engine roared to life and the motorcade proceeded. In their wake, a thick, helpless dread remained on the street. As the old woman finally made her way across, weeping, a boundary had been violated that could never be restored. When Damian's palm connected with her face, it felt as if time stood still. The elderly woman faltered, thrown off balance by the unexpected blow. She collapsed onto the gritty, hard-packed earth. Her bundle of firewood crashed down next to her with a dull thud. A small plume of dust billowed up around her. For a second, all the noise, the yelling, the car engines, the blaring horns melted into a muted drone. Her entire frame ached from the impact. The coarse asphalt had scraped her knees raw and her palms burned. Her heart hammered in her chest, not only from the physical hurt, but from the sheer shock of such unprovoked brutality. She remained on the ground for a moment, quivering, her eyes shut tight, as tears gathered before spilling down her cheeks. She made no sound. She didn't call for assistance. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. Even lying on the pavement, the pile of firewood seemed impossibly heavy. "Oh, dear Lord," she murmured, her voice frail with age and weariness. "Please give me strength." Nobody approached. The line of cars had halted a considerable way back. Onlookers peered out from behind their car windows, their faces ashen and their lips pressed into thin, fearful lines. Agonizingly slowly, she began to stir. She reached out a hand to the strewn branches, collecting them with trembling fingers, before hoisting the bundle back onto her head. Her spine curved even more beneath the load. Yet she uttered no complaint, not a single word. Her breathing became deliberate and even. She pushed herself upright as if the very act of lifting her burden was a form of prayer. One hand braced against the road for support, while the other secured the firewood atop her head. Her legs shook like saplings in a gale, but still she moved forward. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. Her quiet weeping wasn't from weakness, but from profound pain and grief. Her lips trembled. Her eyes stung with tears, yet she continued on, but her gaze never broke from his. Her stare was resolute, profound, and unwavering, filled with an emotion Damian had never encountered. It sliced through the shield of arrogance he wore like a second skin. It was a gaze that told stories of countless struggles of immense suffering and of a deep-seated resilience. It spoke of a dignity that no slap, no insult, and no kick could ever extinguish. She remained completely silent, offering no complaint, no curse. She uttered nothing at all, yet her silence carried a force greater than any physical blow, a truth more piercing than any taunt. She proceeded across the road, each agonizing step a monument to her resolve, each stumble a display of her fortitude. All who witnessed it were suspended in a tense silence. Damian, towering over her, sensed it without quite grasping what it was. Her eyes tracked him, pinning him down, not with rage, but with a quiet, relentless grief that seemed to penetrate every layer of his ego, reaching a place inside him that had never known shame. She crossed the road one step at a time, her tears shimmering in the light, the firewood on her head balanced like a crown of perseverance. Her gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking, as if her eyes alone conveyed the message, "You will answer for this one way or another." Even with the thunder of the convoy's engines and the city humming around them, the silence separating them grew more oppressive than the world itself. After stumbling and struggling to her feet, she pushed onward with a quiet sob, finally crossing the road and fixing him with a deep, penetrating stare. Damian retreated from her path, the sound of his shoes sharp against the pavement. He meticulously straightened his cufflinks and brushed a phantom fleck of dust from his designer suit, as though both the old woman and her struggle were nothing but a minor irritant. His breathing was rapid, his chest heaving, and his eyes still flashed with irritation. But as he drew himself up to his full height, a hint of satisfaction crossed his features. "How absurd," he breathed, the words barely audible, followed by a short, dismissive shake of his head and a harsh chuckle. "Some people actually believe they can stand in my way. It's pathetic." The door to his sedan swung open silently, awaiting him as it always did. He settled into the plush leather interior, letting the soft upholstery envelop him, almost as if it were apologizing for the harshness of the world outside. His security detail buckled his seatbelt with expert efficiency, but he paid them no mind. Leaning his head back against the rest, he exhaled slowly through his nose and let out a crisp, sharp laugh that bounced off the tinted glass. "They will learn," he announced, speaking more to the empty space around him than to any person. "Nobody shows disrespect to Damian Cade and simply walks away." He gestured to the driver, who immediately pressed the accelerator. The procession of vehicles resumed its course, engines purring in perfect harmony, as the black cars created an impenetrable fortress around him. Damian drummed his fingers on the leather armrest, a faint, careless smile playing on his lips. He was sure the incident was already forgotten. He believed it was utterly insignificant. He failed to notice the look in the old woman's eyes. He failed to see the quiet resolve she possessed as she continued her journey across the street. This time his laughter was louder, as if he were taunting the very universe. "Fools," he whispered, tilting his head back. "Complete and utter fools." And as the city lights streaked past his darkened windows, as the sun gleamed off his fleet of cars and reflected in his immaculate shoes, Damian was oblivious to the fact that this single thoughtless act of cruelty, this laugh, this dismissal, this display of arrogance was not just some fleeting moment. It was the very instant that his destiny was sealed. He hadn't been told yet. No one would tell him. But the cosmos had taken note, and his account was already coming due. That burst of laughter would be the last echo of his pride before everything he cherished, and everything he commanded started to come apart at the seams. Yet he remained leaned back, smug, arrogant, and completely unaware that the life he knew was on the verge of changing forever. From the second Damian mocked the old woman and sped away, fate began to sound its quiet alarm. In the beginning, the signs were so small they were almost imperceptible. His fleet of cars, which had always been perfectly reliable, started to fail him. One morning, preparing to head to a crucial meeting, he slipped into his sleek black SUV, admiring the polished leather. He pushed the ignition button, anticipating the familiar roar of the engine, but was met with nothing. Just a soft click in the dead silence. He scowled. "What is the meaning of this?" he grumbled, leaning in and pressing the button once more. The engine gave a weak, pathetic groan, but refused to start. He slammed his fist on the steering wheel, his frustration instantly boiling over. "I don't have time for this foolishness," he barked at his personal mechanic, a man who had served him for over 10 years. What's wrong with it? Damian demanded, his voice cutting through the garage as he paced. Sir, the mechanic began hesitantly. I can't explain it. The engine, the entire transmission system, it all appears to be ruined. This isn't natural wear and tear. I've never encountered anything like this. Damian glared at him, a storm of disbelief and rage swirling inside him. How is that possible? This is a new vehicle. Brand new. How could it be beyond saving? The mechanic couldn't meet his eyes. I just don't know, sir. It's almost as if some external force is causing it to self-destruct. The very next day, a second car gave out. The luxury sedan he used for business trips wouldn't turn over. Its air conditioning system failed, the brakes began to scream, and the engine developed a series of strange rattling noises. This can't be happening, Damian seethed, striking the dashboard with his open palm. His assistant attempted to placate him. Sir, perhaps it's just a strange coincidence. The cars might just need some servicing. We could get a second opinion. But Damian was visibly trembling now, his anger being replaced by a profound sense of disbelief. A coincidence? Are you listening to yourself? He shot back. These are my vehicles. They don't just fail. Ever. By the week's end, a significant portion of his fleet was completely inoperable. Mechanics he'd relied on for years inspected them only to shake their heads in bewilderment. Sir, one of them said cautiously, they're unsalvageable. Something is fundamentally wrong. I have never witnessed an entire collection of cars fail simultaneously like this. Damian's signature laughter, a sound familiar to all in his circle, had completely disappeared. A slight tremor ran through his hands as he traced the outline of a steering wheel on a car that would never be driven again. And the trouble didn't end with the automobiles. A series of minor accidents started to occur, trivial at first, but deeply unsettling. A small electrical fire sparked in the kitchen of his estate. A priceless vase suddenly shattered on its own. Crucial documents started vanishing from his study. Doors would jam at the most inopportune moments. His phone would drop calls. Important emails would fail to send. Each malfunction was bizarre, inexplicable, and their frequency was increasing. He went after everyone, his aides, his legal team, even his closest friends. What the hell is going on? He roared. Why is my entire world collapsing at the same time? They just traded uneasy looks. Nobody had a clue. Maybe you're cursed. Someone dared to whisper a suggestion that earned a bitter laugh from Damian. A curse? That's absurd. I'm Damian Cade. Nobody puts a curse on Damian Cade. And yet, despite his defiant words, the chaos only intensified. One car after another would just die. Mishaps, malfunctions, and systems that were supposed to be foolproof simply gave out. Ignitions failed. Computers blue-screened. Critical meetings were missed. Major projects ground to a halt. Money was hemorrhaging in ways he couldn't even track. A fresh disaster seemed to strike every single day. Whether big or small, each one was baffling. Each one was merciless. The city started to talk. The mechanics talked. His staff talked. It was obvious something was terribly wrong, though no one had the nerve to say it to his face. For the first time in his entire life, Damian felt utterly helpless. And in a corner of his mind, he refused to acknowledge he kept seeing the old woman from the roadside. He hadn't put it all together yet, but her unwavering stare and her quiet power were already in motion. The cosmos was starting to balance its books, and the man who had scoffed so readily was about to find out that no fortune or influence could shield him from the reckoning that was headed his way. The boardroom had always been Damian's domain. The vast, polished table, the imposing chairs, the panoramic windows that overlooked the city he believed he ruled. It had always been his personal stage. He'd enter that room a monarch, and everyone else would fall in line. Every single nod, every handshake, every deal was subject to his whim. But things were different now. Now, whenever he walked into the building, the very air seemed thick with tension. The same eyes that once held a mix of admiration and fear for him, or at the very least obedience, now watched him with a wary, calculating gaze, and most alarmingly with a growing impatience. It started with minor infractions. A report arriving past its deadline, a project suddenly shelved, a voice of dissent rising against him in a meeting. Damian scowled, his frustration mounting. Who authorized this? He demanded, slamming a file onto the table. Utter silence. The customary deferential agreement that typically followed his pronouncements had vanished. One of the directors of Mr. Ives spoke with great deliberation. Sir, it might be prudent to reevaluate the schedule. The market is unpredictable right now. Your projections may not align with the current climate. Damian's eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon, he said, his voice low and threatening. I founded this corporation. I call the shots. The market moves according to my designs, not the other way around. But they didn't even flinch. No one so much as shifted in their seat. They just murmured to one another, sharing knowing looks. Something fundamental had changed. The wall of fear that had always surrounded him had crumbled. The next meeting was a catastrophe. Damian strode in with his usual air of authority, expecting agreement and nods. What he found was a room already buzzing with conversations that stopped the moment he entered. He saw smartphones being slipped under the table and stacks of papers being nervously organized, all while everyone avoided making eye contact. The chairman, someone he once considered an ally, cleared his throat. Damian, we've opted to vote on a new corporate structure, he stated carefully. We think it's in the company's best interest to reallocate some of the equity. What are you talking about? Damian shot back, his voice cracking with sheer disbelief. I have the controlling interest. I'm the one who owns this place. Indeed, the chairman said, his voice perfectly level. But times are changing. We need a different strategy. We need a leader who shares the board's outlook. Your recent decisions have become a point of concern. Concern. Damian felt the bottom drop out of his stomach as his hands clenched into fists. You have the audacity, he bellowed. You're going to stab me in the back after all I've built, all the sacrifices I've made. The vote was called, carried out quietly, almost reverently, without his blessing, without his input. He was stripped of his majority stake. He tried to fight it. He tried to appeal to them. He tried to remind them of his grand plan, of his own money on the line, of the years he'd spent forging this empire from nothing. They just shook their heads. They answered him in calm, dispassionate tones. It's for the good of the organization, they repeated. Our minds are made up. Soon meetings were happening without him. The emails he fired off were met with silence. The calls he placed went to voicemail. The proposals he brought forward were dismissed out of hand. He would walk into rooms to find them discussing the future of his own companies, acting as if he was a ghost. He tried to step into one board meeting and was told coolly, "This is a closed-door session, Damian. We'll fill you in later." Slowly, almost undetectably, at first he was being edged out. His office, once a bastion of power, now felt like a mausoleum. The secretary, who had once snapped to attention at the sound of his voice, now refused to meet his eyes. His own aides whispered behind his back outside his door. The rumor mill was churning in hushed tones. He was no longer the untouchable titan he had always imagined himself to be. He could feel the truth of it in his gut like a spreading frost that chilled him to the bone. Every slight, every exclusion, every cold shoulder was another hairline crack in a life he'd thought was shatterproof. And nobody, least of all him, could prevent the fractures from spreading. Damian Cade, the man who once mocked the poor and steamrolled anyone in his path, was learning a lesson he had never anticipated. That influence can disappear even faster than money, and that hubris can blind the most powerful of men. The empire he'd painstakingly built, the cars, the mansions, the endless stream of cash, was all slipping through his fingers. And the board, once so loyal and compliant, was now forging the nails for his coffin. Day after day they convened without him. Day after day they inked deals he knew nothing about. Day after day they made choices in his stead. The foundations of his authority were crumbling to dust. And Damian, for the first time in his adult life, was helpless to stop it. The mansion had long been his fortress. Its imposing walls and gleaming marble floors, along with rooms overflowing with priceless art and designer furniture, had served as a monument to his power, his fortune, and his untouchable status. Damian used to patrol those halls with his chin held high, savoring the thought of the envy from those looking up at his gates and imagining the awe of every guest who stepped inside. Every last detail, from the gold-plated faucets to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, was a monument to his own success. He truly believed it would be his forever, but he was wrong. One morning he found the doors chained from the inside. A note had been slipped under the main gate. Property seized. Effective immediately. Damian could only stare at it, his body frozen in disbelief. He called his lawyer, his assistant, and then the board, but his calls went unanswered. Bit by bit, the devastating realization began to dawn on him. The mansion, the one place that had always been his kingdom, was no longer his. Every single room, every corridor, every memory sealed within those walls was about to be stripped away from him. Security personnel arrived without a sound, their faces firm and unreadable. "Sir," one of them said, with a polite, almost formal tone, "you'll need to come with us." This property is now under new management. Damian let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound that held none of its old confidence. New management. This is my home, he yelled, his voice echoing down the marble hallways. I built this. This is mine. You have no right to do this. The security men didn't engage. They simply moved with a calm sense of purpose. Sir, we're just following orders. Please collect your personal effects. You have 10 minutes to vacate. Damian's hands trembled as he walked through the halls for the last time. His gaze lingered on the sweeping staircase and the chandelier that had once reflected the light of his extravagant parties. The walls were lined with photographs capturing a life built on a foundation of money, influence, and sheer arrogance. Every footstep he took seemed to amplify the crushing emptiness of his loss. He got to the room where he kept his most valued possessions, a wardrobe packed with bespoke suits, a drawer of watches that cost more than an average person's yearly salary. But he was only permitted to take what he could carry in a small bag. He packed in a rush, shoving in shirts and a few personal mementos, grabbing things that felt like a part of him, though none of it could possibly equal the weight of all he was losing. The bag was small and pitiful, a pathetic contrast to the palace he had once commanded. He slung it over his shoulder. He felt not just the physical weight of its contents, but the immense burden of a life that had completely collapsed. The security team waited patiently by the exit. Sir, one of them repeated, please come this way. Damian stepped into the daylight. The city looked just as it always did, completely indifferent to his fate. The gates slammed shut behind him with a finality that hit him like a physical blow. The mansion, with all its opulence, its power, and its symbols of his reign, was lost to him. He was left with nothing more than the small bag on his shoulder and the souring realization that everything he had considered invincible, everything he had constructed his entire life upon, had been taken away. For the first time, Damian Cade stepped out into the world without the armor of his wealth, without the shield of his power, and without the illusion of love or loyalty. He was completely alone, stripped of everything, carrying nothing but a small bag and the crushing weight of his own hubris. After his business empire began to dissolve, Damian assumed he could at least maintain his personal life, the people who had always orbited him, the women whose adoration had made him feel invincible. But even that fantasy started to crumble slowly and painfully, like sand running through his fingers. It started with the phone calls. His device, which had once been a constant stream of ringing and notifications, now sat completely silent on his desk. He would pick it up anxiously, hoping for another voice, another deal, another invitation. Nothing. A stray vibration, a call he'd missed. He finally called one of his favorite girlfriends, the one whose face always lit up when he walked in. Hello, he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. A moment of silence, and then the line went dead. No explanation, not even a word. He tried another. Damian. She finally answered, her voice filled with an unfamiliar, cold distance. I think we need some space. And then a click. The sound of the call ending rang through the silent apartment, a noise more deafening than any shouting match ever had been. He tried calling the others, but one after another, the voices he had always assumed would answer simply weren't there anymore. Every call was a little shorter, a little icier than the last, until the final one just ended, leaving a dial tone that made the penthouse feel impossibly huge and vacant. He clutched the phone, his eyes locked on the dark screen, half expecting it to light up with a call from someone laughing about the ridiculousness of it all. But the phone stayed dark. The calls never came. Then the friends started to fade away. The same ones who'd clinked glasses at his parties and celebrated his successes. The ones who'd roared with laughter at his terrible expensive jokes now suddenly found the other side of the street fascinating whenever they saw him approaching. The party invitations dried up, and his name, once tagged everywhere, was met with digital silence. Simple greetings on the street devolved into awkward, tight-lipped nods or quick, dismissive waves as people hurried past. He'd walk into the restaurants and clubs he used to own with his presence and feel like a ghost. He could hear the whispers starting as soon as he passed. When people looked his way, they no longer saw Damian Cade, the untouchable titan of industry. They saw a man whose value had plummeted to zero. It was late one night as he sat alone in the cavernous penthouse he hadn't yet been forced to give up that the crushing truth finally dawned on him. They hadn't loved him. They had loved his lifestyle. The money, the influence, the image, that was the whole story. Every single smile, every playful touch, every declaration of love had simply been one side of a deal. Now that he was stripped of his wealth and clout, there was simply no reason for them to stick around. He saw all their faces in his mind, heard their voices and their laughter that had all felt so real. And the weight of that lie, the brutal clarity of his situation was a heavier burden than losing any building or company. Was any of it ever real? He whispered, his voice trembling in the silence. He slumped back into the deep leather chair, his gaze drifting from the ceiling to the sparkling city spread out beneath him, and for the very first time in his life, he felt the sharp, bitter sting of true loneliness. He constructed an entire world for himself, where affection was something you bought and loyalty was just another clause in a contract. With all of that stripped away, the framework of his life was laid bare. Every woman who had squeezed his hand, every friend who had shared a laugh, every person who had pretended to care, it was all a performance. They weren't there for him. They were there for what he provided. The thought was like acid in his veins. A wave of pain, shame, and a profound, empty sadness washed over him. He picked up the phone again, his thumb swiping through contacts he didn't even need to look up. He knew every face, every number, and all he got in return was a blank screen. Not a single message, no missed calls. The notification center was a void. He had always believed he was invincible. But he now knew the truth. His invincibility was just an illusion spun from money. Take away the wealth, take away the influence, and he was suddenly no one. Sitting there in the gloom, the reality struck him with the force of a physical punch. Every scrap of affection he'd ever received had a price tag. Every friendship he'd ever relied on came with terms and conditions. And every woman who ever claimed to adore him had vanished the moment he could no longer afford their time. For the very first time, Damian Cade felt insignificant, helpless, and completely, utterly on his own. The fortress he'd constructed around himself had crumbled, and the man who once mocked the misfortunes of others was now drowning in his own. With the mansion, the fleet of cars, and the fortune all gone, Damian figured he could start again from the ground up. He believed he could leverage the only assets he had left, his intellect, his expertise, and his name. But the kingdom he had governed with an iron fist and sheer hubris was not a forgiving one. He found himself walking into the very offices that used to practically beg for his attention. Places where his name on a caller ID prompted immediate action, where entire staffs would halt their work just for him. Now he was just another man in a long queue holding a crisply folded resume, his custom-tailored suit swapped for a simple one bought with the last of his cash. The receptionist gave him a once-over, her eyebrow arching slightly as she spoke with practiced, cool politeness. "Next," she called. He forced a tight smile, trying to conceal his growing anxiety, and passed his documents across the desk. The interview started. Damian projected confidence, detailing his extensive background, his sharp business acumen, and his proven leadership abilities. But then the interviewer took a second look, and a spark of recognition ignited in their eyes. A quiet word was exchanged with a coworker, followed by a slow shake of the head. "I'm sorry, sir," they finally said. "We won't be able to hire you." "Why not?" Damian demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. "It's your history," the interviewer explained, "your reputation. We can't risk it." A lead weight settled in Damian's stomach. There was a time when his name alone was enough to command entire boardrooms. Now that very same name was an anchor dragging him down. He kept trying, going from one place to the next, extending his hand each time with polite confidence. And every time the moment of recognition would hit, he'd see faces lose their color and hear the hushed conversations start up behind closed doors. "Not that guy," they'd whisper. He's the billionaire." It dawned on Damian with a bitter clarity that his fame, his wealth, and the fear he commanded had once opened every door for him. Now they slammed each one shut. Days blurred into nights. He found a tiny, shabby apartment, precisely the kind he used to ridicule with contemptuous words. With no money for proper meals, he survived on whatever he could get, dry bread and water, and sometimes nothing at all. Hunger became a living creature inside him, sharp and relentless. He would lie on a threadbare mattress staring at the ceiling, his stomach hollow, his body aching, and for the very first time, he experienced what he had always scorned: the powerlessness of poverty, the disgrace of dependency, and the cold bite of starvation. He was haunted by memories of the people he'd disdained, the outstretched hands he'd brushed aside, and the faces he'd laughed at from his car window. And now he understood their reality intimately. The same world that had once bent to his will, that had fawned over his riches, and that had shuddered at his name, now looked right through him as if he didn't exist. No doors swung open, no calls were ever returned, and no friends bothered to check in. And every night as he huddled under a thin blanket, stomach aching and heart heavy, he began to grasp a truth he'd never seen before. Fear and money are only temporary shields. The poor survive through resilience. The wealthy who look down on them are never safe from a fall. And when they tumble, there is nothing to cushion the impact for a fool, nothing but humility and perhaps mercy. Damian Cade, the man who had once laughed at the homeless and sneered at anyone who struggled, was now intimately acquainted with the bitter existence he had once mocked. He went to sleep starving. He wandered the streets unseen. He knocked on doors that would always remain closed. And slowly, agonizingly, he came to realize the world had been turned upside down, and he was the one who had plummeted. Damian walked with a slow, unsteady gait through streets he used to cruise through in polished cars without a single thought. The sidewalks here were fractured and uneven, crammed with vendors, and the air was thick with the smells of smoke, sweat, and grime. He kept his gaze downcast at first, but eventually he summoned the courage to look up. He saw people sitting on the pavement, holding out their hands, their requests for help quiet, their eyes hollow, and their faces weary. For the first time in his life, he felt a sharp, twisting pang of recognition. That could have been me. In fact, that is me now. He stopped at the edge of a chaotic intersection. Cars roared past, horns blaring, but nobody slowed down. Nobody glanced his way. Nobody smiled. He almost instinctively raised a hand as if expecting anyone to notice him, but the crowd around him was utterly indifferent. Mothers pulled their children closer. Workers hurried by, ignoring him, and he realized with a painful sting that this was exactly how he used to view the poor. He had sped past them, rolled up his windows, scoffed at their poverty, and chuckled at their misfortune. And now he was one of them. He sank down onto the curb, setting his small bag beside him. A faint tremor ran through his hands as he rested them on his knees. The blazing fire of his pride had been completely extinguished, replaced by a cold, crushing weight in his chest. Shame washed over him like a fierce, unstoppable tide. People brushed past him without the slightest acknowledgement. Some kicked at litter near his feet, while others shot him impatient glares. No one offered a smile. No one extended a hand. Not a single glance lingered for more than a moment. "Is this me?" he whispered to himself, his voice nearly swallowed by the city's roar. "Is this what I've become?" He clenched his hands into tight fists, biting his lip to hold back tears. A woman nearby adjusted her shawl, completely oblivious to his presence. A man shoved past, muttering to himself, too wrapped up in his own world to notice. And in that instant, Damian felt the full force of his new reality. The loneliness, the humiliation, the raw vulnerability of being unseen, unheard, and unwanted. He looked around and truly saw them all. Men and women, children as well, sitting, crouching, extending their hands. Their faces were all etched with the same exhaustion, the same hunger, the same fight for survival he had once found so contemptible. And the truth hit him like a physical blow. He had spent his entire life elevated above these people, certain of his own superiority, believing his wealth and power made him better. But here he was at last, their equal sharing in their shame, their invisibility, and their profound isolation. Tears began to stream down his face, silent and unbidden. He could feel their warmth on his skin, but he didn't care anymore. He remained on the edge of the curb, feeling the coarse pavement under his palms, feeling the eyes of strangers skate over him as if he were nothing more than a shadow. And in that moment, Damian Cade, the arrogant billionaire who had once held the world in contempt, finally understood the immense weight of every glance he had dismissed, every hand he had ignored, and every life he had ever sneered at. He was standing where the destitute stood, and he would never forget the deep sting of that shame. The night descended like a heavy shroud, wrapping the city in a darkness that seemed to press in on Damian from all sides. The wind sliced through the streets, sharp and bitter, and the chill seeped through his thin jacket, gnawing at his very bones. He had no warm apartment to go back to, no luxury to retreat into, no fireplace to chase away the encroaching cold. The meager sack he was holding felt profoundly heavier tonight, its weight not from its contents, but from the crushing emptiness that pressed on him as he dragged his feet along the desolate road. Each turn he took seemed to lead into deeper darkness, where every shadow stretched longer, and every sound cut sharper through the silence. He came to a halt under a sputtering streetlight, a violent shiver racking his body as he rubbed his palms together, desperate for a sliver of warmth. And then, unexpectedly, her face materialized in his mind's eye. He saw the old woman, fragile and hunched over, hauling her firewood, her tiny body trembling, her hands shaking as she fought to maintain her balance, her lips moving without a sound. He remembered how the sunlight had caught the sheen of her tears on that day. They were small, silent droplets rolling down her cheeks, and he recalled the quiet grace she held onto despite the agony, the shame, and the utter humiliation he'd put her through. He remembered the stillness more than anything. Not one word of fury, not a single curse, not even a plea for mercy. Just those profound, searching, and unwavering eyes that looked right through him, piercing him more sharply than any physical blow ever had. And now in his solitude, cold, starving, and stripped of all he had, the picture was painfully clear. Her silence had been more deafening than any scream. Her tears more burdensome than all the wealth he had ever amassed, and her resilience more formidable than any empire he had ever commanded. Damian collapsed onto the frigid pavement beneath the lonely glow of the light. The night seemed to squeeze in on him as he wrapped his arms around his legs, his gaze lost in the void, but seeing everything with perfect clarity. The memories came flooding back, his own arrogance, his viciousness, the way he used to laugh at the destitute. He recalled the sharp impact of his hand against her delicate frame, the venom in his tone, and the thoughtless aggression that had seemed so meaningless to him at the time. But now, for the first time, it meant the world to him. He murmured into the night, his voice shattering. "I was wrong. I didn't see. I failed to understand." The wind stole his words entirely unconcerned, but a crushing sense of guilt bore down on him from within, a burden far greater than his hunger, the biting cold, or the lonely streets he now roamed like a specter of his former self. For the very first time, Damian grasped that this was not simply a punishment. This was an education. The old woman, with her tears, her silence, and her quiet fortitude, had never really left his thoughts. In truth, she had been with him all along. And now, as the night enveloped him, frozen and broken, he knew he had to locate her, to try and make it right, to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness, to pursue the one virtue he had never bothered to appreciate: humility. And so he remained there for a very long time, trembling in the blackness, consumed by thoughts of her, tormented by her gaze, humbled by her stillness, and realizing with an aching heart that she was the only one who could grant him redemption. Damian got to his feet the following morning, frigid and rigid, his bones protesting from the night's bitter chill. The city around him carried on as apathetic as ever, but a single thought now consumed him, a fire burning more intensely than his hunger or his terror. The old woman. He could still see her eyes, hear her silence, feel her tears. He remembered how her dignity and inner strength shone right through her physical weakness, and how a single look from her had brought him lower than any financial ruin, any lost riches, or any insult. With a newfound resolve, he started walking toward the street where he had last encountered her. The pavement was already shimmering from the morning heat, which created hazy currents around his battered shoes. He made his way to vendors, street cleaners, and anyone sitting by the side of the road, asking them gently, deferentially, "Have you seen her?" An old woman bent over from her years, carrying a bundle of firewood. They all gave him peculiar looks. A number of them just shook their heads. A few even scowled, confused by this strange man who seemed so lost and out of place. "Don't know," one replied, shaking his head. "No one like that in this part of town." Another just shrugged his shoulders. "Can't say I have." Even the children playing by the curb gave him a passing glance before resuming their games. They were all too caught up in their own affairs to give him a second thought. Days stretched on. Damian combed through every nook and cranny of the city, every marketplace, every back street, every dusty path. He pleaded with shopkeepers, bus drivers, and anyone who would spare a moment, but there was absolutely no sign of her. It was as though she had simply dissolved into the air. Nobody knew her destination. Nobody had laid eyes on her. Nothing. Just a profound silence, a void, and a deepening ache in his soul that was heavier than starvation, more brutal than the cold, and more painful than the loss of everything he had once called his own. Finally, utterly defeated, Damian slumped to the ground on the very roadside where she had first entered his world. The sun beat down fiercely on his back, but he was oblivious to it. The traffic roared past. People rushed by, completely indifferent. He felt the grime on his skin, the unforgiving pavement beneath him, and the immense burden of his mistakes pressing him into the ground. And in that moment of despair, he allowed himself to experience all the feelings he had suppressed for so long. Tears streamed down his face without restraint. He didn't bother to wipe them away. He made no attempt to hide his sorrow. He cried out in the open, his body convulsing, his voice breaking, his sobs echoing through the empty air. He confessed his faults aloud to no one but the world around him. "I was cruel, I was conceited, I was so blind, I hurt you. I hurt so many others. I, I was wrong." The words felt alien on his tongue, acrid but strangely liberating. He chanted them over and over, acknowledging all of his sins. He was finally facing the wreckage he'd left behind, the people he'd walked over, the spirits he'd broken, and the ego that had been his own undoing. Stripped bare and broken on the side of the road, hungry, hurting, and emotionally exposed, Damian Cade was hit by an entirely new sensation, a profound and genuine regret. This wasn't the selfish sorrow of being caught, nor was it the sting of losing his fortune or influence. This feeling was visceral, piercing, and pure, both suffocating and liberating him simultaneously. For the first time, he truly grasped the gravity of his choices, the suffering he'd inflicted, and the quiet power of the woman whose silence had spoken volumes more than his riches ever could. So he just sat there, weeping and trembling, by the road, finally accepting the truth. He was not a god, he was not unbreakable, and he was no better than anyone else. It was the first time Damian Cade had ever known what it meant to be humble. Damian remained on the curb, his whole frame racked with tremors, as tears traced paths through the grime on his face. The crushing burden of his guilt made the world around him feel hollow, vast, and uncaring. Yet as his gaze fell listlessly upon the dirt path, a subtle change caught his eye far down the road. A small, stooped silhouette emerged, inching its way closer, which he first dismissed as a figment of his imagination, a mirage born of sunlight and despair. But as the shape became more distinct, the air lodged in his lungs. It was the old woman. Her body was just as fragile and stooped with the years as he recalled. A stack of firewood rested on her head, held in perfect balance as she moved with an unhurried, methodical pace, as if marching to a rhythm entirely her own. With a gentle touch, her hands would occasionally steady the load, every gesture fluid and certain from long practice. They were on the very same path where he had shamed her weeks before, dust kicking up around her tired footwear. The sun shone on her silvery hair, a glimmering reminder of the past he'd fought to bury. Then she raised her head, and her tranquil but sharp eyes met his, holding a silent fortitude and a pardon he had done nothing to deserve, but now craved with every fiber of his being. The world blurred, speeding laws, and the bustling city faded until his entire existence narrowed to her. The very woman with the very same burden, taking the same measured steps on that same stretch of road. An urge to sprint, to fall at her feet and plead for mercy seized him, but his limbs were leaden, anchored by the weight of his own disgrace. His pulse hammered with a confusing mix of terror and anticipation, as if his entire downfall, all the lost pain and brutal self-awareness, had converged on this single pivotal instant. She was right there. She had come back, and some deep intuition told him that this encounter would change the course of his life forever. Acting on pure impulse, Damian pushed himself up from the ground, his legs shaky from starvation and humiliation. Yet a profound and compelling force more powerful than his fear propelled him onward. He stumbled into a run, raising dust, as he instinctively reached for the bundle on her head. "Please allow me," he choked out, his voice cracking with desperation. The old woman stopped, inclining her head just a little as her gaze locked onto his. For a beat, only the swirling dust in the breeze seemed to move. Then with a slow motion, she gave a slight nod, the corners of her mouth turning up in a barely visible smile. Carefully, Damian took the bundle of wood from her, feeling the surprising heft of it settle in his arms. He embraced the strain, though. For the first time, he was carrying a burden that had meaning, a responsibility he had never shouldered. He shifted the wood, ensuring it was secure and perfectly balanced, then found his place at her side, matching her unhurried gait. Each deliberate step felt like a small piece of his guilt being paid. Each movement was a silent act of contrition, and the wood they now shared felt like a bridge between his former hubris and his newfound humility. "Thank you." He breathed, his voice low, as if any louder sound might shatter the fragile peace of the moment. She offered no reply, simply continuing on her way with a steady, serene certainty that radiated from her. It dawned on Damian that speaking was pointless. His actions right now were the only genuine apology he had ever made. And in that single, unassuming gesture of carrying wood together down that familiar dirt road, Damian felt a flicker of something new inside him, a feeling that all his money had never been able to buy, a sensation that all his power and pride had shielded him from. It was transformation. He was no longer the man who mocked the needy. He was no longer the bully who trampled on the vulnerable. For the first time in his life, he was walking with someone sharing the weight of their struggle. In that act, he experienced the faint beginnings of absolution. With the wood held steady, they advanced as one step by painstaking step. One was humbled, the other forgiving, and the path ahead of them seemed to hold the promise of a fresh start. As they journeyed on, Damian's foot caught on something, and he nearly felt the bundle of wood shifting in his arms. In that instant, the full enormity of his life, the lost kingdom, the wasted fortune, the trail of wounded people, and the colossal ego he had nurtured for years all came crashing down on him at once. His legs gave out, sending him to his knees in the dust, his small bag tumbling beside him as his body shook from sheer exhaustion. It was a crushing mix of hunger and shame. Tears cut clean paths through the grime on his face, flowing uncontrollably. He sobbed in a way he never had before, not for money, not for influence, nor for any loss, but for the long years of his own cruelty and arrogance that led him to this very spot. "I was so wrong," he cried, his voice a raw, cracking mess. "So incredibly cruel. I mocked people who were in pain. I hurt you. I hurt so many others. I was just so blind. Please just forgive me." The words poured out of him in a desperate, jumbled rush. His plea, so sincere and weighted with a lifetime of wrongdoing, made the old woman stop in her tracks. She eased the bundle of firewood from her shoulder, her gaze meeting his. For an instant, the world itself seemed to pause, the swirling dust and the breeze falling into a profound silence. Then a soft, serene smile bloomed on her face, one filled with warmth and a deep understanding. "You have suffered," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying a gravity that made Damian shiver. "And through that you have learned." He lifted his head a little, his eyes swollen and red, his voice still quivering. "Please, I am begging for your forgiveness. Truly, from the very bottom of my heart, I am sorry for every single thing." The old woman knelt slightly, just enough to be near him. She laid her hand on his bowed head, a warm and steady touch, and Damian felt an unfamiliar calm seep into his soul. The touch was gentle, yet it carried a weight he could feel in the core of his being, a mixture of mercy, authority, and absolution. "Rise, Damian," she said quietly, her words deliberate and final. "You are forgiven. Your heart has finally learned humility. Your own hands have now carried the kind of burden you once scorned. Let this experience be your guide. Let it shape the man you are still to become." Damian remained there for another moment, head bowed under her hand, letting her words sink deep. They felt like more than forgiveness. They were a blessing, a release, the final seal on the start of his new life. He felt a fundamental shift inside him, a sliver of light where only darkness had been, a spark of hope where only despair had lived. He slowly got to his feet. Trembling, he reached up and touched the hand that rested on his head. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise I will never, ever forget this." The old woman simply nodded, her smile never fading. She hefted the firewood again, her movements steady and sure, and continued on her way, leaving Damian standing there utterly transformed, not by money, not by power, not by fear, but by mercy, by humility, and by the quiet, unshakable power of forgiveness. Damian had barely registered the woman's departure when his phone shattered the quiet of the dusty road with a sharp, insistent ring. He fumbled for it, heart hammering and hands shaking, terrified. It was either more bad news or another cruel twist of fate. The screen displayed a number he didn't recognize. After a deep breath, he answered. "Hello." His voice was a wreck, raw from crying, from begging, and from months of shame and deprivation. "Is this Damian Cade?" a calm, professional voice inquired on the other end. "We've been reviewing applications and have received some strong recommendations. Your background is impressive. We would like to offer you a position effective immediately. We would also like to discuss opportunities to help restore some of your previous business ventures. There is a real potential here for a new beginning." Damian froze, the words slowly penetrating his disbelief. A job offer. This wasn't just a choice. It was a chance to rebuild, to rise from the ashes, to reclaim what he'd lost, not with his old arrogance, but with the hard-won wisdom that came from suffering. His chest grew tight, and for a second he couldn't breathe. I don't know what to say," he whispered, tears welling up once more, but this time they were born of relief and hope, not shame. He turned instinctively, looking for the old woman, the one who had changed everything with her quiet strength and her forgiveness, her blessing. He wanted to thank her properly, to fall to his knees again, to tell her exactly what her mercy had ignited within him. But she was gone. The road stretched out before him, completely empty, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. There were no footprints but his own. No kind eyes, no knowing smile, no frail figure carrying wood. Only the road remained. The very same road where she had appeared, where he had collapsed, where he had kneeled and confessed his sins. Only the road was left, quiet and ordinary, yet it now felt sacred forever, holding the memory of the woman who had given him redemption when he had absolutely nothing. Damian just stood there, phone in his hand, his heart pounding with a mixture of profound awe and longing. He whispered to the empty road, his voice trembling, but now full of promise. Thank you for everything. And with that, he turned to face the path ahead toward a life he would rebuild, a future he would earn, and a man transformed not by wealth and not by power, but by humility, remorse, and the quiet miracle of forgiveness. And then Damian ran. He ran as if for the very first time in his life. It wasn't driven by anger or ego or the desire for more money, but by a heart that was simply overflowing. A knot of emotion tightened in his chest, so powerful he could barely breathe. His feet flew over the dirt road, wind lashing his face while tears streamed down his cheeks without restraint. He was weeping, but these weren't tears of sadness. This was pure joy, a raw, unfiltered happiness that sprang from a soul-deep well of relief, hope, and the profound knowledge that he'd been given a second chance. Each step brought him closer to what he once called home, but he realized that home wasn't the mansion anymore, nor the cars, nor the titles he held. Home was the man he had become. He was someone else now. His arrogance had been replaced by humility, his cruelty by compassion, his blindness by a startling new awareness. The full weight of his past mistakes settled on him. Yet instead of crushing him, it forged him into someone new. He could feel the change deep in his bones and his soul in the very rhythm of his heart. The Damian Cade who had looked down on the poor, who had found amusement in suffering, who had considered himself above consequence, was gone forever. He had learned a final painful and eternal lesson. While pride can raise a man to the heavens, only humility can keep him from falling. He paused for a second, leaning against a lamppost to catch his breath, gazing at the streets where so much suffering had gone unnoticed, where countless people had struggled in silence. He whispered the words like a vow, spoken only to himself. Never again. I will never forget. Every person will be treated with the dignity they deserve. I will honor the struggles of others. I will remember that power is just a passing phase. The tears were still on his face, but they had been transformed. They were no longer signs of shame or fear. They were proof of an awakened heart of a man born again. And then he started running once more, even faster this time. The city spread out all around him, and the road ahead was open, stretching into an endless horizon of new possibilities. Damian Cade was no longer a man defined by his bank account or his anxieties. He was defined by his humility, his empathy, and the lesson he learned from one quiet, frail woman who changed his world. Pride can lift a man high, he murmured to the wind, his voice trembling with emotion. But only humility can keep him there. With that, he ran on, a changed man carrying the promise to live a new kind of life, to love in a new way, and to always remember the dirt road, the bundle of firewood, and the act of forgiveness that had ultimately saved him. Always remember, friends, to treat everyone with dignity, respect those with less, and never forget that power is fleeting, but humility is everlasting.